Recently, there's been a plethora of analyses and video essays coming out about the 2016-2017 anime Sangatsu no Lion. Basically, everyone in the YouTube anime sphere has something to say about how great this show is, how it affected them personally, and how it's a masterpiece, even if it did take forever for it to finally reach that level of popularity. But all this attention is for good reason, because it really is a masterpiece. Based on the original manga from anonymous mangaka Chika Umino and lovingly adapted by Studio Shaft, Sangatsu no Lion manages to be a truly breathtaking show in every sense of the word. It has phenomenal character writing, gorgeous animation, beautiful art direction, an outstanding soundtrack, and overall incredible production value. And all of this goes a long way towards granting Sangatsu no Lion its signature prowess in conveying emotion. I'd argue that these are the primary aspects which make the show's fairly simple premise about shogi feel so profound, and its characters so endearing. But in regards to conveyance, something I haven't heard a lot of other channels talking about is how good Sangatsu no Lion is at using the expressions and visual composition of its characters to achieve this emotional effect. And I don't want this aspect to go unnoticed, because more than in almost any other anime I've seen, these characters have great expressions. For me, this is one of the show's most important components, often creating some of the most visually striking and subtly moving moments in the show. There's just something about Umino's character designs and the way she draws their expressions that give them such an incredible capacity for evoking those same feelings in the viewer. Whether it be joy, sadness, hatred, or determination, Sangatsu no Lion demonstrates the weight and enormity of the emotions its characters are feeling with the subtlest details. Even without its other features, Sangatsu no Lion is exceptional at conveying a lot in single images. This show has crafted some of the most impactful scenes of the medium with its beautiful score and dramatic presentation, but those big moments aren't really what I want to draw attention to here. What I want to focus on are the smaller moments interspersed throughout the bigger ones, which lend to the show's keen sense of mood by putting the viewer in the same headspace as the characters on screen. I won't be going too in-depth on the context and plot circumstances of these images, but even so, I recommend coming back to this video after having watched the show if you still haven't. It's a truly beautiful and captivating story with an excellent cast of characters, so I'd hate to spoil too much of it for you. With that said, let's look at one example of how Sangatsu no Lion uses expression and composition to tell its story. Now, I'm cheating a bit here, as these next images aren't actually from the show itself. They're the Blu-ray covers for the first season, but I'm using them as my first example because they demonstrate what I'm talking about really well. Take a look at this first image. What does this image tell you as the viewer? What is something that you can infer from it? Does anything in particular stand out? Really take a moment to consider it. Okay, now let's look at the second image. What does this image tell you? What's happening in it? Does it make you feel different from the first image? Alright, back to the first image. If you didn't feel anything looking at it the first time, maybe now you will. So we have our protagonist, Rei, in what looks like spring, and most notably, he's by himself. Looking at his surroundings, he's placed against a faded and washed out background where he stands center frame. And looking at Rei himself, he's wearing this agitated, almost angry frown that makes him look frustrated and unsure of himself, and his stiff angular posture also makes him appear anxious and frozen. Looking at this Blu-ray cover from purely a marketing standpoint, it certainly doesn't come off as very immediately eye-catching, but this is exactly the point. The clear emptiness surrounding Rei and his placement at its center makes him stand out as the sole focal point of the image, drawing our eye to him and emphasizing his isolation. Even as simple promotional material, this image conveys to us Rei's loneliness and anxiety as a character. And knowing how Rei starts out the story, living alone in Tokyo with no family, friends, or evident personal connections to cling to, this depiction of Rei makes perfect sense. And it also subtly clues us in to the kind of character struggle he deals with. Now, let's contrast this with the second image. Here, Rei is joined by the Kawamoto sisters, whom he has gotten to know as acquaintances living in a residential block close to his apartment. As shown by the background, it's now summer, indicating the passage of time in the narrative. In this image, Rei is no longer the sole center, so the immediate focus is not on him. Rather, the sisters now share the center with Rei, all while pointing bright smiles in his direction and attempting to pull him closer. Additionally, the background is much more vibrant and saturated this time, making it so the characters blend in more easily with the environment. Unlike the previous image, Rei stands out a lot less here. indicating that maybe he's not as alone as he initially thought. Beyond the simple feelings of endearment this image might elicit in you, there's also a lot being told here about the relationship Rei has with the Kawamotos. Through their faces and body language, the sisters are shown eagerly inviting Rei in, both physically and emotionally. But Rei's mixed reaction shows his reluctance to accept this offer and his apprehensiveness to get close to another family. This is what I mean when I refer to expression and composition. Through the structure of the image, what's happening in it, and the expressions shown on the characters' faces, the dynamic between Rei and the Kawamotos is revealed without having to explicitly state anything. Most of the character shots in Sangatsu no Lion function this way, and to prove that, I'm going to use the remainder of the video to show off some of my favorites. First, we'll stick with Rei. Let's take this shot from the first episode. What does this shot communicate to us? As a close-up, the image feels rather claustrophobic. The hypothetical camera is set at an awkward distance from Rei's face here, making it so neither his head nor his shoulders entirely fit within the bounds of the frame, almost like he's being boxed in by it. And despite how close the shot is, Rei's gaze remains downcast, indicating that he's fixated on something else, and either unable or unwilling to look up at us. The contours of his mouth don't quite make a frown, but the dullness in his expression gives his face a general sense of vacancy. Overall, Rei seems detached and closed off, and the sketchy filter laid over him helps emphasize this even further. Even without the context of the scene this image is taken from, this image leaves an immediate and purposeful impression of what Rei is feeling here. This is Rei's emotional wall, and here he's determined to remain behind it. This is because that wall is put up towards his adoptive father, whom Rei is afraid to face and open up to. Rather than looking up towards his father, Rei stays fixated on the shogi board in front of him, indicating how Rei uses shogi as a crutch to distract himself from the difficulties in his life. We can do a similar analysis of this next image, which shows us what happens when that emotional wall does get breached. Here, Rei's whole upper half is pictured, and he's looking straight ahead. He's also not in a close-up this time, rather he is instead made to appear distant. When combined with the wind blowing past him, his disappointed frown, and his targeted stare, this makes Rei look disapproving and irritated. Given the incredibly few instances of aggressive emotion we've seen Rei express up until this point, his dismissive attitude stands out a lot here. And that dismissive attitude is directed towards one of his defeated shogi opponents, a father going through a divorce who has just given up on seeing his daughter for Christmas. Considering Rei's own lack of strong familial connections, it's no surprise that he would express this kind of sentiment towards a man so willing to simply let his family ties dissolve, and that this image comes right before one of the emotional peaks of the first season, where Rei's bottled up feelings cause him to finally lash out at his circumstances. When Akari is first introduced, we learn that despite still being in her early 20s, she is effectively the sole matriarch and head of household for the Kawamoto family, due to the early passing of her mother. And despite Akari's outwardly pleasant and enjoyable demeanor, it's not until the second season where we finally get a glimpse into the true difficulty and strain her position puts on her. In the example I've chosen, when Akari is describing the aftermath of her mother's death, she's cast against a stark, colorless background while a dark sky literally hangs over her, giving the image an immediate sense of bleakness and despair. She wears a heavy frown while her eyes look simultaneously weary and distraught. But despite the distressed feelings she displays, the positioning of her younger sisters around her demonstrates that she is the one doing the supporting here, giving her no time to mourn for herself. All at once, Akari appears devastated by loss, yet also frustrated with her seemingly hopeless situation, as she is forced to bottle up her own trauma. In this instant, Akari is overwhelmed with the burden she has to bear, and yet there is nothing she can do to prevent it, creating this tragic little moment for her character. But one thing that I love about Akari's expressions is that no matter what, she always appears strong, showing how, despite her unfair circumstances, she remains willing to endure any hardship if it's for the sake of her sisters. This resolve can be seen in this next image as Akari prepares herself to face the equally unpleasant mother of her younger sister's school bully. Notice how, in this shot, the camera is looking up at Akari while she stares directly forwards, making her appear confident, determined, and nearly triumphant. Additionally, the bright orange background and the strong lighting highlight Akari's fierce mood, evoking feelings of a fiery passion. Though the unsure shape of her mouth and the blush on her face do reveal a little bit of hesitance, her straightforward stare still indicates a sense of inner strength which holds that feeling back. So while she's not totally unflinching, she nonetheless appears steady and brave. With all this put together, we can surmise that despite her fear, Akari remains persistent to overcome this challenge for the better of her family. Now I want to talk about Rei's adoptive sister, Kyoko, who, by my metric, has some of the best expressions in the show. Among the whole cast, Kyoko is probably the most unstable, as she is almost entirely defined and driven by the emotional baggage she carries with her from her past. As an individual, Kyoko is as cold as ice, but she's also just as fragile, so it makes sense that more than anything else about her character, the way she emotes is what gives us the most insight into it. When we first see Kyoko interact with Rei, the background and lighting she's cast against give her the impression of someone cold and mysterious. Though her eyes remain level with the camera, putting her at the same level as both Rei and the audience, the way in which she stares so intently into the frame makes her feel somewhat untrustworthy, as though she is intentionally trying to appear the opposite. And given her sharp gaze and deceitful smile, it's clear that something about her is dubious. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly, but just the look in her eyes feels off-putting, almost condescending. As far as character introductions go, Kyoko's is particularly memorable for the inherently negative and uncomfortable atmosphere her very presence creates, as she continues to feign innocence and act like she and her adoptive brother are on good terms. At this point in the narrative, it's still unclear whether Kyoko's intentions are hostile or not, but it's in this deliberate unpredictability with which she's portrayed that the show's creators are able to delicately foreshadow the extremely volatile, manipulative, and passive-aggressive person she later proves herself to be. Compared to the other characters introduced so far, Kyoko comes off as a total enigma when she shows up on screen. Now take this expression, which is much more direct about Kyoko's true feelings and intent. In this image, the camera is set at a low angle, as Kyoko literally looks down at us and directs her intense glare right at the focus of the frame, telling us that she is the one with the power in this situation. Combined with her heavy frown and resentful stare, Kyoko emits an intimidating aura here, and gains immediate control over the picture. In this one image, Sangatsu no Lion manages to capture not only the powerful presence that Kyoko commands, but also the sheer magnitude of her contempt for Rei. At the very beginning of the show, we're shown a clip of Kyoko referring to Rei as Zero because of his name, essentially calling him worthless and beneath her consideration. And here, that same sentiment can still be felt. As her past with Rei is explained through flashback, this is the moment we're given a visual contextualization of Kyoko's spite for him. In this next shot, the situation gets completely reversed. Here, a young Kyoko looks up at us, while we, from the perspective of her father, look down at her, which kind of clues us into why she does the same thing to Rei as she gets older. In this moment, Kyoko is completely powerless as her father essentially abandons her and her shogi talents in favor of Rei's, and her expression perfectly conveys the bitterness that she feels as a result. As her streams of tears, red cheeks, sharp scowl, and overtly aggressive body posture demonstrate, Kyoko is experiencing multiple negative emotions here. Emotions of rage, rejection, embarrassment, and hatred. The pure resentment that Kyoko displays here is palpable, and it leaves a lasting impression about her character for the remainder of the show. Like the scorching white background that surrounds her, this image has burned itself into my head. The first time I watched the episode it appears in, I just couldn't stop thinking about it. In an instant, all of Kyoko's trauma from her father's neglect is given form, and the impact that it leaves is just tragic. In case it isn't clear by now, I absolutely adore Sangatsu no Lion. It's easily one of my favorite shows of all time, and I'm really glad so many other people have been picking up that same sentiment after the first season really flew under the radar. To be honest, if I had the time, I would break down the whole show frame by frame. But if you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like or subscribing for future content, and thanks for watching.